January morning, Western Europe. The ground is locked in frost, the air sharp enough to cut lungs. A gray battlefield lies half lit by weak winter light, scattered with shattered timber, torn earth, and bodies that have not moved since the night before. From the American lines, a single figure steps forward. No rifle, no helmet markings of rank, only a red cross stitched onto his armband, already darkened by mud and blood. Across the field, German soldiers watch him advance. Some laugh, some shout warnings he cannot understand. An unarmed man, walking upright where bullets still crack the air, looks absurd in a war built on steel and fear. Then the laughter fades, because the wounded are everywhere. Men groaning in shell holes, men bleeding into frozen soil. German voices, once sharp with command, now weak, desperate, human. The medic does not slow. He kneels beside the first body, enemy uniform, shattered leg, and opens his kit. In that moment, the battlefield changes, not with an explosion, but with a choice. And as the wounded begin to call out, not for victory, not for surrender, but for mercy, the war pauses just long enough for something unexpected to emerge.
By the time American medics stepped onto the battlefields of Europe, the war had already stripped mercy from the landscape. World War II was not a conflict of maneuver alone. It was a war of annihilation, ideology, and exhaustion. By 1943, both sides had learned that survival depended on speed, firepower, and the willingness to push men forward even when the ground was already soaked with blood. The United States Army arrived late to the European war, but it arrived with doctrine shaped by hard lessons. The Army Medical Department was not designed to win battles. Its mission was simpler, and in many ways more dangerous: keep men alive long enough to fight again. American medics were non-combatants by definition. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, they carried no weapons and wore visible Red Cross markings meant to protect them. In theory, they were untouchable. In practice, the battlefield did not care. Artillery did not discriminate. Snipers often did not either. German soldiers understood the symbol of the Red Cross. Many respected it. Many did not. As the war dragged on and losses mounted, restraint eroded. Medics were sometimes spared, sometimes targeted deliberately, because removing a medic meant removing hope. American training emphasized proximity. Medics were taught to move with the infantry, not behind it. They advanced under fire, crawled into shell holes, and treated wounds where men fell. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, bandages, tourniquets. Seconds mattered. Hesitation killed. By late 1944, this reality intensified. The Allied push through France and into Germany turned villages into fortresses and fields into graveyards. Cold set in. Supplies stretched thin. Casualties soared. For German units, the situation was worse. The Wehrmacht was no longer the confident force of 1939 or 1941. Veterans had been lost on the Eastern Front. Replacements were younger, older, or untrained. Medical evacuation broke down under constant pressure from Allied air power. Wounded men were often left where they fell. In this environment, the presence of an American medic was unsettling. He carried no threat, yet he walked forward when others hit the dirt. He knelt beside the fallen without asking which side they were on. To hardened soldiers raised on discipline and survival, this behavior looked foolish, naive, even laughable. Until the shells landed closer, until blood loss became unbearable, until shouting for help stopped sounding like weakness and started sounding like life. Because when a man is wounded badly enough, ideology dissolves, uniforms lose meaning, pain reduces everything to the same urgent truth. And on those frozen fields, surrounded by men who could no longer fight, the role of the medic became something far larger than doctrine ever intended. It became a test of whether humanity still had a place in modern war. That question had been forming long before the first American medic crossed into German fire, and it did not emerge by accident.
The idea that mercy could survive on a 20th century battlefield was already under strain before American forces reached Germany's borders. World War II had redefined violence. Machine guns, high explosive artillery, and air power compressed time between injury and death. A wound that might have been survivable in earlier wars became fatal within minutes. For soldiers on both sides, the sight of the wounded was constant, overwhelming, and emotionally numbing. German military culture placed heavy emphasis on endurance and obedience. The ideal soldier was expected to endure pain without complaint, to hold position regardless of cost. Medical aid existed, but it was structured around evacuation to the rear, something increasingly impossible as Allied pressure collapsed transportation networks. As the front lines became fluid, wounded men were abandoned in shell craters, barns, and forest edges. Some were recovered days later, many were not. American doctrine evolved differently. U.S. infantry units embedded medics directly into platoons. These men were trained to ignore instinct and move toward danger. They carried the authority to decide who could be saved and who could not, a burden that followed them long after the war. Importantly, American medics were trained to treat enemy wounded when possible. The Geneva Convention required it, but beyond legality, U.S. military leadership believed such conduct reinforced discipline and moral clarity. A soldier who could show restraint under fire was considered more reliable, not less. On the ground, however, that principle collided with fear. German soldiers had heard stories, some true, some exaggerated. Stories of medics shot deliberately, stories of booby-trapped wounded, stories of false surrender. Trust was a rare commodity. Yet the reality of battlefield medicine ignored politics. Bleeding did not care about nationality. Shock did not pause for ideology. A crushed femur or torn abdomen demanded immediate action, or death followed. As Allied forces advanced through Belgium, the Rhineland, and into the heart of Germany, encounters between American medics and German wounded became more frequent. Often these moments occurred in the margins of battle, after firing slowed, but before control was secured. Sometimes an informal ceasefire emerged. Sometimes it did not. What distinguished the moments that endured in memory was not official command, but individual choice. A medic deciding to cross open ground, a wounded enemy deciding not to fire, a battlefield deciding briefly to stop killing. German soldiers who mocked medics often did so as a defense mechanism. Laughter masked fear, mockery maintained distance from vulnerability. To acknowledge the medic's courage was to admit one's own fragility. But war has a way of stripping illusions quickly. When evacuation failed, when comrades bled out beside them, when the front line collapsed and the rear no longer existed, in those moments the medic was the last line between agony and relief, between survival and silence. And when the same man who had been laughed at returned again and again, kneeling beside bodies in enemy uniforms, working without pause, the dynamic shifted. Respect replaced ridicule, then dependence. Because the battlefield, at its most honest, recognizes only one truth: who is willing to help when nothing is gained in return? That truth would soon confront both sides directly, not in theory,
but under fire, and it would unfold through a series of human, tactical, and moral perspectives that reveal why this moment mattered far beyond a single frozen field. The American medic was not trained to be fearless. He was trained to function despite fear. Most were young men, often barely out of training camps in the United States, suddenly responsible for lives that could end in their hands. They memorized anatomy, learned to recognize shock, and practiced applying tourniquets in seconds. But no manual could prepare them for the sound a man makes when he knows he is dying. Medics did not carry rifles. Their only protection was the belief that someone, somewhere, would honor the Red Cross. When they stepped forward, they did so alone. Infantrymen watched from cover, unable to follow. Officers could not order safety. For the medic, every wounded man became immediate. Names disappeared, uniforms blurred. There was only breathing or the absence of it. Treating enemy wounded required emotional control few possessed. To kneel beside a man who moments earlier might have been firing at you demanded restraint deeper than courage. It demanded a belief that saving a life mattered, even when it changed nothing strategically. For the wounded German soldier, the experience was disorienting. He expected capture or execution or indifference. Instead, he found hands working quickly, efficiently, without hatred. Pain still existed, fear still lingered, but confusion entered the space where certainty once lived. In that confusion, something fragile emerged: trust. German soldiers were conditioned to expect violence, not compassion, from advancing enemies. By late war, propaganda and battlefield experience reinforced the idea that surrender could be fatal. Seeing an American medic approach challenged that expectation. At first, laughter served as armor. Mocking an unarmed enemy maintained psychological dominance. It allowed observers to believe control still existed. But control vanished the moment a man fell wounded. German medical units were overwhelmed or destroyed. Evacuation routes were gone. Morphine was scarce. Bandages ran out. When an American medic treated a German wound competently, stopping bleeding, easing pain, it created a rupture in belief. This enemy did not kill when he could. He chose to save. For wounded men, that choice mattered more than ideology. It meant survival. It meant the chance to see home again. Some whispered warnings to comrades not to fire. Others raised hands weakly. The battlefield's invisible lines shifted. Total war erodes morality by necessity. Every hesitation risks death. Every act of mercy carries consequence. Yet medics operated at a unique intersection. They were instruments of war who did not kill. They existed within violence while resisting it. Saving an enemy wounded man risked anger from one's own side. Resources were limited. Time was precious. But refusing aid risked something deeper: the loss of moral authority that soldiers relied on to justify the fight. The medic's choice sent a message without words, that not everything was permitted, that even here some lines remained. On frozen fields surrounded by ruin, this restraint carried weight. It reshaped how both sides perceived the moment unfolding. And as the wounded multiplied, the battlefield began to reorganize itself around that choice, drawing in tactical realities that could no longer be ignored. From a purely tactical perspective, medics were anomalies. They moved where no advance was ordered. They exposed themselves without suppressive fire.
They altered the tempo of battle without command authorization, yet their presence changed the battlefield. When a medic entered open ground, firing often slowed, not because of orders, but because of hesitation. Soldiers on both sides recognized the risk of killing someone who posed no threat. This hesitation created brief pockets of calm, moments where wounded could be reached, moments where units could reorganize. Veteran officers noticed this effect. Some allowed it. Some quietly depended on it. On occasions where enemy wounded were treated openly, informal pauses emerged, weapons lowered slightly, eyes followed the medic rather than the sights. These moments did not end battles, but they softened edges enough to prevent escalation. American military leadership understood that discipline was not only enforced, it was modeled. Medics embodied restraint under pressure. They reinforced the idea that the U.S. Army fought with limits, even when the enemy did not. Officers rarely interfered with a medic's decisions. They trusted their judgment, even when it meant aiding enemy wounded. German junior leaders observed this closely. In a collapsing command structure, behavior replaced orders. When American medics acted predictably, consistently, without cruelty, it encouraged wounded Germans to stop resisting. This reduced last-stand behavior. It saved lives on both sides. Leadership was no longer issuing commands, it was being demonstrated in real time. War conditions men to dehumanize. That process makes killing possible. The medic reversed it. By addressing pain directly, by touching wounds, by speaking calmly, he reintroduced individuality into chaos. German wounded stopped seeing Americans as faceless enemies. American infantry stopped seeing Germans as targets once incapacitated. This psychological shift spread quietly. It did not erase violence, but it restrained it. And restraint in war is powerful. Because when fear recedes even slightly, choices expand. That expansion set the stage for a moment when choice became unavoidable, when fire, suffering, and decision collided at once. The battlefield was about to reach a breaking point. The turning point did not arrive with an order. It arrived with a scream. Somewhere between the American line and the shattered remnants of a German position, artillery struck again. Not a direct hit, close enough. The concussion lifted dirt, ice, and bodies. Men who had been wounded moments earlier were wounded again. Those who had been silent began to cry out. The American medic was already forward. He dropped beside a crater where two German soldiers lay tangled together, one unconscious, the other pressing a hand against his abdomen. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark against the snow. Small arms fire cracked nearby, not aimed at him, not stopping either. The medic worked fast. He did not look up. He applied pressure, administered morphine, marked the man's forehead. Then he moved. With each step, the risk increased. Infantrymen on both sides watched. Triggers were squeezed and then released. A German machine gun, positioned farther back, had clear sight lines. Its crew could have ended the scene in seconds. They did not. Because now the wounded were calling out clearly, in broken English, in German, in the universal language of pain. Medic, helfen, bitte. The laughter from earlier was gone. What replaced it was recognition. This unarmed man controlled the moment, not with force, but with action. As casualties mounted, more wounded appeared. American soldiers gestured to German wounded to stay still. German soldiers shouted to their own men not to fire. The battlefield contracted around the medic's movements. Then, from the edge of the field, a German officer emerged. His weapon was slung, his posture rigid. He raised a hand. It was not surrender, it was acknowledgement. For several minutes, unrecorded, unofficial, fragile, the shooting stopped. The medic continued working. And in that narrow window, the meaning of the war shifted, because now mercy was no longer theoretical, it was visible, and it was about to be tested one final time. The silence did not feel safe. It felt borrowed. Every man on that field understood how easily it could end, with a single shot, a single misjudgment, a single act of fear. The medic moved anyway. He crossed ground that minutes earlier had been lethal. Boots crunching on frozen soil, breath visible in the air, hands already numb from blood and cold. He reached another German wounded soldier, younger than the others, barely more than a boy. Shrapnel had torn into his thigh. The bleeding was severe. The medic knelt, applied a tourniquet, tightened it carefully. The boy screamed, then faded. Nearby, American infantry watched in disbelief. Some had lost friends to German fire only hours earlier, yet none raised a weapon. The German officer lowered his hand slowly. He spoke quietly to the men behind him. The machine gun barrel dipped. In that moment, laughter turned into pleading, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply human. More wounded called out. Some dragged themselves forward. Others raised arms weakly, signaling surrender without words. The medic could not save them all. He triaged ruthlessly. He marked those beyond help. He moved past men he knew would die. That decision stayed with him long after the war, but the act itself changed something immediate. German soldiers who could still fight chose not to. American soldiers who could still fire chose not to. When shooting resumed later, it did so elsewhere, away from that ground. By then, prisoners were being gathered. Wounded were being evacuated. The battlefield had reorganized itself around restraint. No medals were awarded that day. No official ceasefire logged. No report captured the moment fully. But men remembered. They remembered the medic who walked forward while others hid. They remembered the enemy who asked for help and received it. And when the war moved on, as it always did, the consequences of that moment followed quietly behind. Because mercy, once shown, leaves evidence, and that evidence would shape what came next, both immediately and long after the guns moved forward. When the firing shifted and units advanced, the field was no longer the same place. Bodies had been moved. Wounded were gone or marked. The snow was stained and trampled, the ground reshaped by hands instead of shells. American infantry secured the position with little resistance. German survivors surrendered without last stands or desperate charges. Many were already exhausted, physically and mentally drained by days of retreat. The medic returned to his unit without ceremony. His uniform was soaked. His hands shook once the adrenaline faded. There was no time to process what had happened. More wounded waited. In reports filed later, the engagement appeared routine. A successful advance, enemy casualties, prisoners taken. Moments of mercy rarely fit into after-action summaries. Yet among the soldiers who witnessed it, the impact was immediate. American troops spoke quietly of what they had seen, not with pride, with disbelief. They had watched an enemy stop shooting, not because they were forced, but because they chose to. German prisoners, when questioned, mentioned the medic more than the firefight. They described relief, confusion, gratitude. Some asked whether the man who treated them would be safe. For German wounded who survived evacuation, the memory followed them into captivity.
It complicated narratives they had been taught. It introduced doubt where certainty had once lived. On the American side, the medics' actions reinforced belief in restraint as strength, not weakness. Officers noted improved compliance among surrendering enemy units in subsequent engagements. Word traveled faster than paperwork. This was not unique to one battlefield. Similar moments occurred across Europe, often unrecorded, often dismissed as anomalies. But they mattered. Because war is not shaped only by strategy and firepower, it is shaped by behavior, especially in moments when no one is watching. And while the immediate fighting moved on, the deeper consequences of that choice began to surface in unexpected ways. Not in headlines, in memory. In the weeks that followed, the war pressed forward relentlessly. Front lines shifted, maps were redrawn, new towns fell, new names were added to casualty lists. The medic remained where he had always been, at the edge of violence, moving just behind the point of contact. There was no official recognition tied to that frozen field. No citation recorded the pause, the lowered weapons, or the wounded who survived because someone chose to kneel instead of fire. That was normal. Acts of restraint rarely survive bureaucracy. But among veterans, the story endured in fragments, passed quietly from one soldier to another, recalled in hospital wards, in prisoner camps, in letters never sent. For German wounded taken that day, survival altered the trajectory of their lives. Some returned home years later, carrying scars that reminded them not only of pain, but of mercy from an enemy they had been told would show none. For American soldiers who witnessed it, the moment reinforced a belief that would follow them long after discharge, that they had not become what the war demanded of its worst participants. This mattered more than medals. Historians later struggled to quantify such moments. They left no clear paper trail, only overlapping testimonies, patterns of behavior, a noticeable reduction in resistance when medics appeared openly on certain fronts. The Geneva Convention, often violated, found its strongest enforcement not in courts, but in individuals who chose to honor it under fire. As the war ended and the world attempted to rebuild meaning from destruction, these moments formed quiet counterweights to the overwhelming narrative of brutality. They did not redeem the war, nothing could, but they prevented total collapse of moral boundaries. And when veterans spoke decades later, many returned to similar memories, not of killing, but of restraint, of a medic stepping forward, of an enemy calling for help, of laughter fading into pleading. Those memories lingered because they revealed something unsettling and hopeful at once, that even in the most mechanized slaughter humanity had ever created, choice still existed. And that choice left a mark far deeper than shrapnel. One final question remained. What did such moments ultimately mean when measured against the scale of the war itself? History remembers World War II through its largest forces, armies measured in millions, battles spanning continents, machines designed to kill faster than any war before it. But history is also shaped in the spaces between those forces. On a frozen field, an unarmed medic stepped forward when every instinct said to stay down. He did not change the outcome of the war. He did not alter grand strategy or redraw borders. What he changed was smaller and more enduring. He proved that even in total war, limits could exist. That discipline was not only the ability to fight, but the ability to stop. That mercy, when offered without expectation, carried power no weapon could match. German wounded who begged for his help were not betraying their cause. They were acknowledging something older than nations and uniforms, the instinct to survive, and the hope that another human might care. American soldiers who watched did not lose resolve. They gained clarity. War demands violence, but it does not erase choice. That truth is easy to forget when looking at maps and casualty figures. It is harder to forget when imagining a man kneeling in the snow, hands shaking, ignoring bullets to stop bleeding he did not cause. The laughter that once followed him across the field faded quickly. What replaced it was silence, and then gratitude. In the end, that is why such moments endure. Not because they were common, but because they were rare. And because they remind us that even at humanity's lowest point, someone chose to act as if humanity still mattered.